Why does parental alienation often occur during or after a divorce? Well, in this book, Foundations by Dr. Craig Childress, we learn that it's not actually the divorce that creates the alienation. Rather, it's the divorce that exposes existing personality structures like narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder that were already there beneath the surface. In tonight's video, we're going to break down chapter 4, which is the driving engine of alienation. And we're going to explore what really happens when we're going to explore what happens psychologically when a pathological parent experiences a divorce. Why does that divorce or the relationship ending trigger such a collapse? And why do they recruit their children to take sides in the first place? How does a child taking sides, how does that lead to the parent being stabilized psychologically? And most importantly, how does this affect the child and their developing sense of self? So, welcome, you guys. Hope everybody's having a good week. This chapter was a little difficult for me to read as somebody who has been the child in this dynamic. For those who don't know me, hi, welcome. My name is Maddie, and I lived through this child psychological abuse for 20 years. My mom, during their marriage, actually, once their marriage started to fail, my mom went on a rampage to turn me against my dad. And it worked. And for 20 years, I rejected my dad. And now I seek to educate the public about this form of abuse. I've also been on a healing journey. It's going to be a lifelong healing journey, and been rebuilding my relationship with my dad for the past 4 years now. And it's been great, that part of it. Tonight, I have this weekly live show that I do every night on Wednesdays, 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So welcome if you're new. For those of you who've been showing up, thanks for showing up. I hope you've gotten the book, because I'm not going to cover everything in the book. I'm going to cover what I think are the most important points. But I want to say something, and this is probably my first true critique of Dr. Childress's work here. He says that the divorce is the driving agent behind the alienation beginning. I would push back against that, at least in my case, being the child. The alienation and the psychological abuse definitely began while my parents were still married. And I think as soon as there was a fracture in the relationship and a hint of separating, which might have been 2 years before they actually got divorced, it began during their marriage. So I would push back and actually say that the driving engine of alienation is less about the divorce and more about the fractured marriage, if that makes sense. But before we get into actually the slideshow that I've put up for tonight, I do think it's important to review last week for anybody who wasn't here, and also for people who just could use a review. So I put together this little video from last week's episode to give people some context that you're really going to need to understand for tonight's video. So I hope you don't mind, but let's just take a look at this.
Welcome to part 2, the personality disorder level of the video. So why should we care about the origins of attachment? If you want to understand what happened to a child, don't just look at the child. Look at the family system they had to survive. And why should we care about personality disorders? The attachment system contains our fundamental expectations for self and others in relationships. When a child is labeled as defiant or anxious, sometimes the child isn't the problem. They are the signal. To understand personality pathology, we must first understand internal working models. These are internalized patterns of relationship expectations formed during childhood. This diagram illustrates how a young child builds a sense of emotional well-being through relationships with others, considering their view of self, others, and the world. Internal working models guide all of our future emotionally close relationships. In unhealthy systems, the family adapts around dysfunction, and the child often pays the price. When the internal working models are distorted and pathological, then the formation of personality characteristics will be equally distorted. Both borderline and narcissistic personalities share the same expectations for self and others. For self, they believe, I am fundamentally inadequate. For others, the other person will reject and abandon me because of my fundamental inadequacy. The difference between borderline and narcissistic personality disorder is their external presentation, which is the result of the defensive organization around their core beliefs.
Sorry about this depressing, intense music, by the way. I did not choose the music. I guess it just, naturally read the subject matter and it was like, wow, what a downer. Let me put something there that matches the stuff you're going to present. I hope everybody's following. By the way, I answer your questions and your comments in the live chat at the end of the video. So leave me all of your comments and questions.
Individuals with borderline personality have minimal to no defensive structure for their internalized beliefs. This causes continual, intense emotional instability, leading them to seek externalized defense structures. The external defense for those negative beliefs is often an idealized love and perfect fusion with an attachment figure. This means seeking continual demonstrations of complete devotion, which can result in psychological enmeshment. When a child becomes the emotional support for a parent with BPD or NPD, they are no longer allowed to be a child. They become the emotional regulator, therapist, protector, or source of narcissistic supply or fusion. Signs of enmeshed parenting include invasion of privacy, micromonitoring, guilt manipulation, and discouraging independence. The child may manage the parent's emotions or become their caregiver. When a rupture or breach occurs with an attachment figure, individuals with BDP are fundamentally unable to repair it. This leads to a complete collapse and primal disorganization, as they need a continually fused state of consciousness for regulation. This video clip by Otto Kernberg discusses what causes identity diffusion in BPD and NPD. In contrast, the narcissistic personality structure has a very rudimentary defensive structure for their internalized beliefs, which protects them from their core fears. They use grandiose self-inflation and project core beliefs of self-inadequacy onto others. This projection dismisses the importance of relationships, as expressed by the phrase, "You're not rejecting me, I'm rejecting you." What happens if this narcissistic defense is threatened? Narcissistic injury is a profound emotional wound that occurs when they face perceived criticism, rejection, or boundary setting. The threatened self-esteem causes a collapse into rage, shame, humiliation, and emptiness. This is why continual external validation, or narcissistic supply, is sought from others. The next step is understanding how to identify these patterns in relationships. Individuals with BPD and NPD are both seen as exploitative. Why is this the case? It is because both personalities use another person to meet their emotional and psychological needs. The other person's role is to serve as an external regulatory object. In parental alienation, the BDP or NPD parent forms a cross-generational coalition to exploit the child's induced rejection of the other parent. Why do they do this? To regulate their core vulnerabilities of self-inadequacy that were activated through the divorce. For the child, they learn that love equals emotional captivity, attachment equals responsibility, boundaries equal rejection, and independence equals betrayal. That belief system follows them into adulthood. Join us next week for a video on the driving engine of alienation.
Okay, enough of that depressing music. So, if I asked you guys to just brainstorm on why divorce might represent the fundamental driving engine of alienation, what would you say? Would it have to do with maybe rejection? Maybe the pathological parent's core inadequacy, core negative self-beliefs are being triggered because they're being rejected. What would you say? I'm curious to know. According to Dr. Childress in this book, the divorce represents a fundamental rejection of the narcissistic or borderline personality parent due to his or her inadequacies in the spousal relationship. And it's this public rejection of the parent as a spouse that triggers the core personality vulnerabilities, which is that belief that both personality disorders have of self-inadequacy and the fear of being abandoned. I forgot to put my slideshow up. Okay, guys. Welcome. Welcome to chapter 4. This book is taking it a lot out of me, guys, but I do think it's really important to know this stuff if you've lived through it or if you're currently living through it. So, chapter 4, the driving engine of alienation. According to Dr. Childress, divorce. According to me, marital discord. Why is the divorce the driving engine for the alienation process in the family? Well, like I just said, the first reason is because the divorce represents a fundamental rejection of that pathological parent. And it's important that they interpret this rejection as due to their own inadequacies, those fundamental vulnerabilities in their core, those negative self-beliefs are triggered. And let's be honest, a lot of the time, the rejection is due to these inadequacies. The second reason why the divorce is the driving engine behind this psychological abuse is because this is a public rejection. When you get divorced, you can't just pretend like you're still together. Eventually, the cat's out of the bag and people know that you've split. And so it's a public rejection, and the public rejection triggers the parents' core vulnerabilities and inadequacies and fear of abandonment. So the chapter goes on to basically break up the narcissistic style response to divorce versus the borderline style response to divorce. Okay, this chapter was extremely eye-opening for me because I've always thought, my parent, never formally diagnosed, but definitely has one or not both of these personality disorders. And this chapter helped me understand what I have been dealing with, what my parent has been suffering through too. So first, Dr. Childress talks about the narcissistic response to divorce. And when we were thinking about last week and the little review that I did at the beginning of my live stream tonight, they were talking about how the narcissistic personality disorder person has a defense against these vulnerabilities, the self-inadequacy and fear of abandonment. They have a somewhat of a defense that they have made themselves. It's a more complete defense than the borderline personality disorder parent has, because they don't have an internal defense. That's why they are always in such agony and horrible emotional state. But the narcissistic defense, it's important to know that the defense that is built up with that grandiosity and all the projection, it is more effective against the abandonment fears than it is against the fears of self-inadequacy. In other words, the defense that they're able to create to guard themselves against the emotional turmoil that comes with having these negative self-beliefs is more effective against the fear of abandonment than the fear of being inadequate. So they have a more difficult time, even though they have this defense, they still have a more difficult time with the self-inadequacy portion rather than the fear of abandonment. In fact, and this is coming from the book, the more complete defense against abandonment fears offered by the narcissistic self-inflation potentially makes the narcissistic personality even more exposed to assaults on self-inadequacy. So Dr. Childress states that for the narcissistic style parent, the interpersonal rejection inherent to divorce threatens to collapse the fragile psychological defense of narcissistic self-inflation that the narcissistic parent maintains against the experience of primal self-inadequacy. The divorce is a public exposure of the spousal inadequacy of the narcissistic parent, and it represents rejection by the attachment figure. Now, that rejection by the attachment figure it triggers the vulnerabilities of being rejected and abandoned. The divorce represents a direct hit on the core vulnerabilities of the narcissistic parent that provokes two sources of tremendous anxiety for the parent with narcissistic personality disorder. The two sources of extreme anxiety for the narcissistic parent. First is the exposure of self-inadequacy. The second is a tremendous anxiety related to abandonment fears. So, while superficially the narcissistic personality appears to present as confident and self-assured, this presentation is merely a fragile defense veneer against the experience of fundamental self-inadequacy that exists at the core of the narcissistic self-structure. Additionally, the fear of abandonment is so profound that the only defense available to entirely dismiss the importance of others and banish from all awareness the desire to form an attachment bond to others. So it makes sense to me that they would have a fear of exposure, that they're inadequate. That's very intuitive to me with the narcissistic personality disorder. But the profound abandonment fears, to me, that's a little harder to detect. And that would make sense given what Dr. Childress has said, that the defense is more complete and effective against abandonment fears than exposure of self-inadequacy. So the only defense they have, just to repeat, is to completely dismiss others altogether. It's like totally black and white. They write you off. Okay. It's like they paint you black the second you have rejected them. And their other defense is just to reject attachments altogether. I wanted to read this quote because I thought it was important to include. So, the narcissistic defense is predicated on psychologically expelling the experience of self-inadequacy by projecting this rejected quality onto others. The fear of being rejected by the other person is also psychologically expelled onto others. Through the narcissistic defense, the other person is dismissively rejected by the narcissistic personality as being expendable and unimportant. So they project what they feel about themselves, that they're inadequate, not good enough, that they're not worthy of love, whatever it might be. They project that onto others and they say, you're inadequate, you're unworthy, you're not good enough to be loved by me, instead of just facing their own core wounds and working on that. So the divorce is threatening to collapse this fragile narcissistic defense. And this is the worst fear, that the fragile narcissistic defense will collapse, because it is fragile. And if it collapses, all hell breaks loose. Sorry, some of these pages are like falling out of my book because I've read each chapter twice. And so for future books, Dr. Childress needs to work on the binding process, I think. But let's continue. So on page 73, he writes, the divorce places pressure on both aspects of the narcissistic defense. It triggers a public exposure of the narcissist's primal self-inadequacy and awakens the experience of the deep abandonment fears. Okay, so they have a fear of being rejected by the other person, and they're able to psychologically expel that fear by displacing it onto others. The divorce is threatening to collapse this fragile narcissistic self-defense, like the slide shows. And this is the precise reason why they pull the child into the entanglement. This is why, right here. Because their defense collapses. That is why they alienate their child. People might think to get revenge on the other parent, that's part of it. To hurt their child, weaponize their child, be the favorite parent, that's part of it too. But at the core of it is because their narcissistic defense has collapsed. Let me try to explain this a little bit better. So we've talked about this a lot. We've talked about these cross-generational coalitions and cutoffs. So usually you have a father and mother. They're on the same hierarchical level together above the children. You have a cross-generational coalition where the father or mother recruits the child, and the child is brought up into the hierarchy of being a parent, and the other parent is put down to a lower hierarchy of a child. And this cross-generational coalition is a way that the narcissist is able to reestablish their defenses psychologically. So they induce the child into rejecting the other parent, something that I bet a lot of you are familiar with. But why do they do this? Dr. Childress explains it pretty aptly. He says, well, through the child's rejection of the parent for the alleged parental inadequacy, in other words, through the child's rejection of the targeted parent, the person with the narcissistic personality disorder is able to once again expel onto the other parent their own primal self-inadequacy. That is their defensive structure. That is how they psychologically defend themselves against the horror and the pain and the impossibility of living consciously with those negative vulnerabilities and self-beliefs. So what they do is they project everything they feel about themselves onto others, and that's their defensive strategy psychologically. And if they've been exposed through a divorce, well, they can't do that to their partner anymore. So they use their child to do it to their partner. When this clicked is this clicking for you guys? Because when this clicked in my head, I was, oh my gosh, it was just the oddest feeling to realize that I had been used as part of a desperate attempt for my parent to regain their psychological defense against their self-inadequacies. I just thought this is a funny little image to share. All narcissists tell themselves projection is the process through which they reveal who they are and what they're doing. If you've ever wondered what they're up to, you should think about what the narcissist has accused you or others of doing lately. So, ultimately, the child rejection of the targeted parent publicly exposes the targeted parent's alleged inadequacy. Do you guys see what's going on here? The child becomes a vehicle to project the narcissist's crap onto the other parent. Just to go back to the book for a second. Through the child's rejection of the targeted parent, it becomes the targeted parent who is being publicly exposed as the inadequate parent, which is what the narcissist wants. The narcissistic borderline parent is using the child's rejection of the targeted parent to publicly expose the targeted parent's supposed fundamental inadequacy and abandonment, which reestablishes the narcissistic defense by projecting these primal vulnerabilities onto the other person. Reestablishing the narcissistic defense directly through the spousal relationship is impossible because in the spousal relationship, it is the narcissist that is being exposed as the inadequate person and who is being rejected for this fundamental inadequacy. However, The narcissistic defense can be reestablished by triangulating the child into the spousal conflict and then using the child's rejection of the targeted parent to define the targeted parent as the inadequate and rejected person. Let me know if you guys were aware of this already or if this is new information to you, because to me, when I learned this, it really, really helped make sense of everything. Everything's coming together in reading this book, which reestablishes the narcissist defense. They're good to go. Why can't the NPD parent reestablish the defense directly through the spousal relationship? I just touched on that a second ago. This is impossible. Cannot happen. It's impossible because in the spousal relationship, the narcissist is already being exposed and rejected as the inadequate person. And their ex is not taking that projection anymore. The ex is stepping away. They say no more. So it's impossible. It's pretty clear to me that the child is being used and exploited, but the book actually breaks down a few different ways that the child is being used and exploited. So an important regulatory role for the child is to be the external symbol of narcissistic superiority and victory over the other parent, like a freaking trophy. This makes me think of it literally of a trophy. Talk about objectification and using your child like an object. The child becomes a trophy. Possession of the child represents a symbol of narcissistic superiority and the victory of the narcissistic parent over the targeted parent. Sick. Pretty sick. It also says, number 2, the child is being used and exploited, and this one might come pretty easily to a lot of you guys, instinctively, I should say, if you're familiar with this personality. They're using their child as a source of narcissistic supply. The possession of the idealized child who's totally dedicated to the narcissistic parent also provides the narcissistic, I'm saying narcissist so many times, it's like getting jumbled. The possession of the idolized child who is totally dedicated to the NPD parent also provides that parent with a source of narcissistic supply from the child's elicited adoration and dedication to that parent. Now, I'm also going to read a quote that Dr. Childress chose to include in here that comes from Kernberg. He says, quote, "The need to control the idolized objects, to use them in attempts to manipulate and exploit the environment, and to destroy potential enemies is linked with an inordinate pride in the possession of these perfect objects totally dedicated to the patient." What does that sound like to you guys? I've talked about cult-like parenting on here before. I broke down a study one time. I also read a book about cults. This is making me think of cults. Dedicated, totally dedicated, manipulated and exploited. There's also a third way that the pathogenic parent, in this case, will use and abuse and exploit their child. And that is to exact a retaliatory revenge on the other parent. The narcissistic personality has what the targeted parent wants, the child. By completely possessing the child who is desired by the targeted parent, And by withholding the coveted child from the targeted parent, the narcissistic parent is able to exact a cruel revenge on the other spouse. And in their sick, twisted mind, delusional mind, they're exacting this revenge for the following reason. Because their spouse failed to appreciate their self-inflated magnificence. And because their spouse, even if they did the rejecting themselves, their spouse abandoned them. That's why. They're out for blood. That's why. These people. I want to bring it back to the children as always. This comes from Lisa Romano. If you were the child of a narcissist, you were abandoned. This is not made up. You were actually abandoned emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. Narcissistic parents project their own flaws onto their children, which causes great psychological abuse. So this projection, it's not limited to the ex-spouse. It often becomes a situation where the pathological parent begins to project all of their flaws and inadequacies onto their children. Ask me how I know. Fun stuff. Okay, so now we're going to get into the borderline style to divorce, which is a little bit different, actually. Also, thank you guys for the comments and questions. I will get to those at the end of the episode, I promise. But let's talk about the borderline style response to divorce, because the narcissistic style made sense to me. I can see that in my parent, but the borderline style is like the overwhelming response of my parent. So this is personal to me, but it's also, I know it's really personal to a lot of you guys out there. A lot of you guys have parents like this. A lot of you guys are dealing with a spouse like this or an ex-spouse like this. So when we were going over last week's episode, I think you will remember that the narcissistic personality disorder and the borderline personality disorder individual, they share the same core vulnerabilities, those same fear of abandonment, self-inadequacy. Those are the main two. The difference is the outward manifestation, because the narcissistic personality disorder is able to form somewhat of a rudimentary defense against this psychologically. However, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't really know, the borderline personality lacks an internal defense structure. They do not have a defense against this turmoil, against these inner beliefs. They don't. And they experience intense abandonment fears. That is way more pronounced in the borderline personality disorder. So let's recall. The borderline personality disorder, they do not have an internalized defense structure like the narcissistic personality, but they do have somewhat of an outward defense structure, which is to find an idealized regulatory other and become completely psychologically fused to that person, almost to the point where they are sharing a psyche with another person. And this is often their spouse. But when you bring a fracture, a breach, or rupture, there's a problem in the marriage. As we went over at the beginning of this video, these personality disordered people cannot handle disagreements or ruptures or breaches in the relationship. They do not have the capacity to repair relationships. And so when there is a breach in the marriage, a fracture in the marriage, they have to find a new regulatory other and become psychologically fused to someone else. And if you're a parent going through a really painful divorce, well, a lot of these parents find that regulatory other and become psychologically fused to their child. And this is just my theory. This is not in the book that I have found so far, but I've always wondered, this is a tiny tangent and then we'll get back to the slideshow, but I've always wondered myself, like, why was I the only child in my family who was alienated from my dad? And I've had a lot of different theories in my brain because I'm the oldest of 5. I'm also the only girl. So I have 4 younger brothers. At first I thought that had to do something with that. There has to be something there, that I was the only girl and I was the oldest. So I made like I was a very good regulatory object for my mom. You know, I listened to her cry. I comforted her a lot. I naturally had that empathy and compassion towards her. Whereas my brothers, I might have still really wanted to be like my dad or respected my dad. I don't know. I was just thinking in my brain a lot about this. And then there's the personality style differences between my brothers and the way and my personality, which is that I am hard to control and they are not, essentially. And so I've been thinking a lot about this, obviously, the past 4 years, but this chapter really helped me to understand everything in a full perspective. So for the borderline personality disorder parents, divorce mostly triggers the abandonment fears. I mean, think of the worst you've ever been triggered in your life, your most emotional states that you've experienced on this earth. That's probably what this person is feeling. And I'm not saying that to give you compassion or make you compassionate towards this individual. I'm just trying to have people understand that this is an amount of anxiety that is just incredible anxiety. And so they attempt to prevent this abandonment. They do everything in their power to prevent this abandonment. So the first thing they do, how they cope with the extreme abandonment fears coming to the surface, is they replace their spouse with their child as their new regulatory object. If you're wondering about emotional incest, yes, this is exactly what that is. This is exactly that. Yes. Unfortunately. So the borderline style engages the child into a hyper-bonded emotional relationship. And the child has to become the perfect regulatory object who will never abandon the borderline parent. I think it all makes sense to me now, going back to what I was telling you about, that I was chosen by my mom because I was the oldest and I was the only girl. Girls being more sensitive and attuned to emotions, and you know, maybe I was more compassionate toward her and what she was going through. Also, I was the oldest, so I had more developed brain, and I was able to be a better regulatory object for her than my younger brothers would have been, because they're just like, doo-doo-doo. I was more in tune. I had already been pretty much programmed to assess her emotions, you know, assess the entire room, emotionally console her, regulate her, etc. And you know, this is kind of creepy if you think about it, what they do. And it's very sad. You know, my mom would always make me promise you won't leave me. Boys leave when they get married and find a wife. Boys leave their mother, but girls stay. Girls always stay. Promise me you'll stay. Constantly having me swear to her throughout my life until my adulthood, starting at age of 8 or 9 until my adulthood, that I would never leave her. I mean, terrified that I would leave her. And this was interesting to me too. Let me see if the next slide. Okay. Yeah, this is it right here. Okay, so everything that we just went over, that's a lot to handle. That's really dark. That's a lot to put on a child, right? It gets worse because also for the borderline style parent, the possession of the child who is of value to the targeted parent also prevents the borderline parent from experiencing full abandonment. I'm going to say it another way to make sure that you guys understand what this means. As long as the borderline parent has possession of the child, the ex-spouse will remain continually involved with the borderline parent's emotional regulation. The ongoing drama surrounding custody and visitation and the continual intrusion of the borderline parent into the home life of the targeted parent that is afforded by the shared relationship with the child are manifestations of the borderline personality's efforts to maintain the relationship with the other spouse, therefore avoiding abandonment by the ex-spouse. Guys, I know this is true. You don't have to take my word for it, but I know this is true for myself. My mom never got over my dad. Never. She would say 20 years later, I think I made a mistake divorcing your dad. So I know that this is true. This is what happens. The possession of the child, custody disruptions, and other dramas surrounding this abuse are attempts at the borderline parent to keep the bond with their ex-spouse from being severed. They use the child to maintain a relationship with their ex. And of course, with the more borderline style parent, it is often the remarriage of the targeted parent that triggers the borderline's abandonment fears that much more. It makes sense because they seem to still want their ex. Now, the rest of this chapter talks about stylistic differences. And like I said, I'm not going to read all of every chapter to you guys, but I'm going to end with, what does this do to the child? Psychological effects. Let's start with there. This is not a comprehensive list, by the way. So psychological effects, the first clear psychological effect will be identity distortion. The child is recruited to carry the parent's projected shame and inadequacy. The parent has all of this darkness inside of them and they throw it into their child. And that causes the child to develop a false self in order to maintain that attachment with their parent. So what ends up happening is the child suppresses their feelings. The child suppresses a lot of feelings. Their feelings toward the targeted parent, their feeling toward the alienating parent, their feelings toward the world, and their feelings toward themselves. Overall suppression of authentic feelings across the board. And what they internalize is that if I love both of my parents, I will lose one of them. And children naturally have that splitting mechanism in their brain. Black and white thinking comes more naturally to children until they have more brain development. But this is enhanced because of the abuse, and they experience what's called a fractured identity formation. And this is often a hallmark of complex PTSD as well. So the chronic anxiety and hypervigilance goes without saying. You probably developed this if you were married to a personality disordered person. The child learns to constantly monitor their parents' emotional state all the time. Constant. They are looking for signs of their parents' fear of abandonment or retaliation. Also, they know that they're going to experience a lot of retaliation for certain things, like if they upset their parent, if they go against their parents' wishes, if they look at their parent the wrong way, the list is endless. What this means for the child's nervous system is that they are going to be in a constant state of fight or flight for months, years, possibly decades, which I recently learned, I don't know if you guys know this, but that the number one cause of a shortened lifespan is chronic stress. So this is serious for these little children and teenagers, young adults, for people in their bodies and their lifespan. Another symptom of all of this is emotional caretaking. They become emotional caretakers and they start to see themselves as that role, as playing that role. So then in later life, in their romantic relationships, they might gravitate towards someone who needs caretaking. And then there's the shame-based core beliefs, which are just so sad and so hard to deprogram. Because the child is used as a vehicle for projected inadequacy, they often develop the following beliefs, like I'm responsible for others' emotions, love must be earned, and if someone leaves me, it's my fault. A sense of deep unworthiness. I just feel so bad for all kids going through any abuse, but especially kids going through the same abuse that I went through, because I know just how devastating, painful it is. Emotional effects. Clearly, you have some emotional enmeshment going on. I mean, the brain, what the parent wants is complete psychological fusion with their child's brain. Oh, God, I just know what that's like. So you have to have the same beliefs, the same thoughts, the same morals, the same values, the same opinions, the same preferences, the same likes, the same everything as your parent, or else it's not okay with them. The child becomes a therapist, a confidant, an emotional regulator, maybe a best friend. They are not allowed any developmental separation. This can be really harmful for children, especially those children that that aren't as strong-willed. And of course, we see parentification, difficulty identifying their own feelings, and guilt for taking steps toward independence or autonomy. Suppression of grief, very common. The child experiences a lot of loss in this dynamic, and they're not allowed to grieve any of it. So the child experiences the loss of one parent. Like, I grieved my dad like he was dead, privately, not publicly. They also experience the divorce, which is the loss of the family unit. They experience the loss of stability in their life and the loss of psychological safety. But like I mentioned, they cannot grieve, at least not publicly, because grief would imply that that parent mattered to them, that there was love being lost. And that would be a huge, huge betrayal to your abusive parent. So the grief has to go somewhere. And often it comes out as depression, irritability. And if it's held in the body, stored in the body for so long, just like the abuse is, it will lead to physical health problems, somatic symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, irritability, OCD, whatever it might be. And it just gets worse and worse as the years go on. Social effects. The child would probably have some impaired peer relationships. I mean, not only do they not know how to operate in a world with boundaries because of the enmeshment and parentification, but they also are clearly going to struggle with trust. They're going to probably over-attach to people quickly, or they will avoid intimacy altogether. It depends on how their attachment system has been disrupted, whether they develop anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, or disorganized attachment style. They may replicate what they have been shown by their parent. And so this is a case of like, they don't know better until they learn better. Because if you grow up in a house that smells like constant, thick cat pee, hang with me, then when you eventually leave the house years later, you're going to carry that smell with you. And it's not your fault. There's nothing you could have done. But when others point it out to you, you can wash your clothes. You can start taking care of yourself. So we kind of learn what love is based on how it's modeled to us. And then we get out in the real world and we can learn more, hopefully experience unconditional love and change for the better. So I've seen this a lot with other people. I don't necessarily have this so much, but I've met a lot of people who've gone through this abuse as children who have this effect. Authority and attachment confusion, distrust towards adults, especially like anyone with an authority position, like not knowing how to handle people with authority, like whether it's people like police officers or teachers or anyone in a position of authority. Difficulty respecting healthy boundaries, like I mentioned, and susceptibility to coercive relationships. That's a big one. So falling into an abusive relationship in your adult life with friends, coworkers, or your romantic relationships, because it's so familiar to you and normal to you that you don't notice that it's destructive. And then you have the physical effects. This is a brief little glimpse over what could be an entire iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. So poor neurobiological outcomes across the board. Chronic relational trauma alters stress systems, like I mentioned earlier. So common manifestations are headaches, GI issues, sleeping issues, immune dysregulation, panic symptoms. If you have a prolonged activation of the stress response, you might see even worse effects, which could be cortisol not being regulated, difficulties with your executive functioning. You could actually see the prefrontal cortex and different aspects of the brain shrinking. Because they were under such a state of chronic stress for so many years that those structures in the brain did not have the opportunity to develop properly. It's very sad. Essentially, the child's body carries the war, and these parents don't give a damn. Long-term outcomes, I think there needs to be more research into this particular area. If unaddressed, these children are at higher risk for complex PTSD, attachment disorders, repetition of narcissistic or borderline relationship patterns. That's probably the worst outcome I could think of. Identity diffusion, codependency, anxiety, depressive disorders. What I didn't put on here, I didn't put on there, but it would be like harming behaviors or taking their own life. It's actually very common. Many of these children will grow up to become adults who are high achieving but internally empty. That's me. That was me, at least. None of my school teachers or anyone in my life would ever have thought that anything to the extent that was going on would have been going on, because I got straight A's. I mean, I got into a really good school, good college, still graduated with honors, dean's lists, all the semesters. So the academics is not a sure sign of whether or not someone's struggling. A lot of people become chronic caretakers of others, and they don't know how to take care of themselves. Or estranged adults trying to untangle reality from conditioning. Some people get to the place where they're just like, screw all of you, and they walk away from their family system altogether. The bottom line. What do you guys think? What is the bottom line besides don't do this to your child? The bottom line is the core injury to the child. And this is really hard to accept, even for me now. Even for me, probably for the rest of my life, I'll have a hard time accepting this, but this is the core injury. The child was never loved for who they are, for who they were. I was not loved or appreciated for who I truly am. I'm still not loved or appreciated by some family members for who I truly am. Maybe they have an idea of me in their head that they want me to be, that they love, but for who I truly am, me, no. The child was used. I was used as a means to project self-inadequacy onto my other parent, as a source of narcissistic supply to build my parents' ego up, as a source of leverage to get what they want, and leverage so that they would not be completely abandoned by my other parent. I was used as a tool for revenge, and probably more than anything else, I was used as a regulatory object. And this is why the trust has been completely broken. This is my opinion. Feel free to disagree with me. Always feel free to disagree with me politely, please. But my opinion is this, that the real casualty of this entire family dynamic, it's not either spouse, it's not the marriage, it's the child. It's the child's developing self, their developing brain, their developing personality, they're developing beliefs about themselves and the world and others and love, their beliefs about their value. When a child becomes a parent's regulator, a therapist for the parent, an ally, a weapon, a regulatory object, they stop developing normally. When a child becomes a parent's tool, they stop developing normally. And when you use a child to stabilize your own broken attachment system, you don't just hurt your ex-spouse. I can guarantee you that. What you're actually doing is you fracture your child's developing self. And that child's developing self is the adult they will become. It can take decades to put that self back together, if they ever even start to in the first place. Coming up next week. I know that was really, really tough. It was tough for me to read through. It was tough for me to read through this chapter, to make this slideshow, to read through this slideshow, to express honestly with you guys my point of view on all of this. And actually, this should say coming up in 2 weeks. Next week, it will be the role reversal core. But that's one of the announcements I have to make. Oh gosh. Okay, so if you follow me on any social, I'll also put out a newsletter about this. But next week, I am going to be unable to do my weekly live show because my baby is turning 1 year old. So that'll be awesome and fun. And then I will have a live show. Let me pull up my calendar. Oh, come on. I will have a live show on the 18th of March. That will be the only other live show I have on Wednesdays in March will be the 18th, because the 25th is my birthday. So I'm going to take the night off for my birthday. Yes, my baby was born 2 weeks exactly before my own birthday. And now I'm going to get to your comments and questions. Kevin says, I believe it's a form of projection onto the children from unhealed trauma of the alienating parent. Bam! You got it right so fast. Ellen says, my children are just now seeing it. Praise the Lord. That's amazing. Love that, Ellen. That's so awesome. A lot of people, if it extends into adulthood, will not see it. So that's great news. Yes, Kevin says the children are not able to be authentic. They must mirror the narc. Exactly. They have to have that false self instilled in them, which erases or covers up their authentic true self. Oh, Ellen. Okay, Ellen's telling me a little bit more about her situation. She says, my daughter's was the first to see it when she had babies. Having babies, having children really will wake you up to so many things about your own upbringing. For a lot of people, I've said this before, but for a lot of people, having kids makes them more appreciative of how much their parents sacrificed or all the effort that their parents showed, the way they were raised, etc. For me, having babies was a bit of the opposite experience. While there were some things that I was very grateful for, I just had more questions than anything. Just like, how could my parent have done this if they had loved me like I love my kids? I don't know if that makes sense. My daughter-in-law is doing it to my son. Cut me out of the family. I'm so sorry. That's very common. It actually goes back to what I was talking about falling into coercive relationships in adulthood. A big effect, not being able to see the dysfunction, then the chance that you're going to get into a relationship and repeat the cycle is actually quite high. Oh, Suzanne became a new YouTube member. Welcome to the club. Bruce says, question, at that point, did you begin fawning behavior? I think I just need like a little bit more information. At what point are you wondering? Because I probably had that on and on for years. Oh, a lot of good questions from Bruce. Question, was your ability to remain open to the reattachment with your dad something that was just suppressed, or did it appear suddenly? I'm sure if you asked a psychologist about that, they would give you some different answer. But in my point of view, okay, I never hoped for a day that my dad and I would have a better relationship. It was that much written off in my head. So it appeared suddenly to me. I had to realize who my mom really was and then start to question if she had lied about my dad. And it appeared suddenly. It was probably suppressed, but to me, it appeared suddenly. It wasn't like I was never actively suppressing anything like that. Question, if an adult who is acting as a mandatory reporter had attempted to intervene in your case, how would it have been viewed by you and your mom? Oh, my mom would have gone off the deep end. My mom would have, I wouldn't even put past what my mom would have done. Anything. She would have done anything to get me back into her, I was going to say clutches, but let's just say custody. How would I have viewed it? If it weren't handled a certain way, it would have been actually, either way, it would have been traumatic for me. But I've said before, and I'll say it again, I wish someone had identified the psychological abuse, and I wish I had been taken away from my mom. I wish there had been a protective order in place for a long, long time, and that I was able to restore my relationship with my dad. Easier said than done, I know. This question is so close to home for me, Bruce. Why do you think people with BDP are difficult to treat? Because for the same reason that you can lead a horse to water and you can't make them drink it. You can point out everything you need them to change, everything you need them to do, everything that's hurting you. But if they're living in their own delusional world and they will refuse to see it, they will refuse to accept it or acknowledge it. They have to want to change for themselves, kind of like an addict. Like an addict has to decide to recover for themselves in order to truly recover. And I think there's an aspect, this is just my opinion, I'm not a researcher or therapist or whatever, but I think there's an aspect of delusion with borderline personality disorder, and it makes it hard for them to understand how their actions affect others. They're also pathological liars. They lie to themselves. So reality is kind of, it doesn't exist for them. Thank you guys so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I hope that you found this helpful or insightful. Like I said, I will not be doing my live show next week because it's my daughter's first birthday. So I will see you on March 18th, actually. And we will be covering chapter 5. Chapter 5. So chapter 5, and it's not too late to get the book because this is going to be a long series, you guys. Like, this is as far as we're going. We've read this much, and we have still this much to go. So chapter 5 starts on page 88, and there are 366 pages in this book. Whew. We will get through it. My cat needs me to let her out now. Thank you guys for being here. and I will see you on the 18th.